if you've been here before, you know where to turn in your Bibles. We are, believe it or not, we are on sermon number 20 on our way through the Gospel of John. I keep track and number them, and I thought, man, that's a milestone. I think 22 or 25 is about the longest series that I've done. So we're getting close, but we're also getting close to the end of the Gospel, chapter 18. We talked last week, 14, 15, 16, 17, all four chapters of John. John gives us kind of Jesus' teachings and Jesus' prayer in the upper room and so forth that he's talked to his disciples. And now in John 18, he comes back to kind of the narrative or the story of what's happening around Jesus and the events that are leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, which is going to be next Sunday. And so we kind of come back to the story. One of the important parts of a story is characters, and John has 16 characters that he develops in one chapter. So there's all sorts of people in chapter 18 that are coming into the story and coming out of the story, people doing talking, people interacting. Of those 16, you can kind of boil it down to 5 major characters that have a part in this story. Jesus obviously has a part, and when Jesus had spoken these words is the first words of the chapter. So Jesus is one of the main ones. Then in verse 2, you're introduced to Judas, who also has a main part. If you're familiar with the Christian story, the story of Christ's crucifixion, you know Judas plays a major part. Then Peter has his part that he plays as the chapter unfolds. And then you've got the leaders, the religious leaders that are kind of putting Jesus on trial. And then at the end of the chapter, you've got Pilate. So those are kind of the 5 main characters, although there are several others that John kind of writes about as they interact and come in and out of the story. Last Sunday, I went about 8 minutes over what I usually try to or like to go. So I'm going to try to go 8 minutes under what I usually try to go to give you those 8 minutes back that you lost last Sunday. So we'll see how it goes. Let's start at John 18, and we'll work with the first 11 verses here. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" You see how John is developing this story. Usually when a betrayer gets a group of soldiers to come, there's this surprise of they catch him and they surprise him, and they usually they bring the soldiers so that they can't escape by force, so that they can't run away, and the soldiers' job is to catch him. And immediately Jesus turns this around. One of John's points as he presents this, and one of the things Jesus is trying to show his disciples as well as the people who are coming, is I am not a victim of this. I'm not a victim of Judas's betrayal. This is not something that is outside of my control, and man, if only he hadn't, or if only this had happened, or if only I knew, then I could have gotten away. I am not a victim, and I am not out of control here. This is what I've been preparing for. This is what I've been praying about. This is the hour that I have been looking to all along the book of John. He's been talking about the hour has come, or the hour is coming. So instead of waiting for the soldiers to come find him and to question him, Jesus goes to them, asks them, "Who are you looking for?" And Jesus asks the questions first. Jesus initiates the interrogation. Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward in verse 4 and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," and the he is understood, so literally what he said was, "I am," which is a reference back to Exodus, back to the Old Testament, the name of God. When he said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." Again, we see Jesus in control. Jesus is saying, I'm the person you're looking for. You don't need my disciples. Let them go. Wanting to protect his disciples. Wanting to make sure that they're okay. You came for me. I'm here. Take me and leave them. In verse 9, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost no one. Then Simon Peter enters into the story. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Again reminding him, why is this happening? Why are these soldiers here? Yes, Judas betrayed me, or is betraying me. But this is from the Father. This is the cup that the Father has poured for me. So the first notes that you have there, Jesus is prepared for what is coming. See if this is going to work for me today, Seattle. Jesus is prepared for what is coming. Peter is surprised by what comes and acts foolishly. I know that sometimes it's easy to kick Peter because he often opens his mouth and he often gets in trouble. And rightly so. There's been a lot of people who stand up for Peter because he's an incredible disciple. He acts when a lot of them are too scared to act. He speaks when a lot of them don't know what to say. We just sang that song Oceans, which is basically written about his interaction with Jesus Christ on the water. He steps out onto the water when no one else is going to step out on the boat. So there's a lot written to defend and spoken to defend Peter. But this is foolish. There's no two ways about it. Think about what Jesus is trying to do. First, Jesus is asserting that I am in control, that I know what's happening. This is not a surprise to me. This is not catching me off guard. That caught me off guard. This is not catching me off guard. And Peter comes along and tries to take over the situation. Peter comes along and tries to intervene and interact. The other thing that Jesus is trying to do is to protect his disciples. He says, I am Jesus. I'm the one you're looking for. Take me and leave them. So what does Peter do? Peter pulls a sword and swings at one of the servants. If there's anything that's going to get the soldiers, a lot of you are soldiers. A lot of you have dealt with civilians, armed or unarmed, where you don't know if they're armed or unarmed. When one of them pulls a weapon and attacks you, that's a good way to get the civilians in trouble. That's a good way for violence to escalate. So Jesus is trying to de-escalate the situation. Jesus is trying to say, I'm Jesus, leave these people alone. What does Peter do? He gets a sword out and attacks one of them. And then third, Jesus has been waiting for this. Jesus has been walking towards this, knowing that this is the hour that's coming. Literally, he's saying, my Father is handing me this cup. And here is Peter trying to knock the cup out of Jesus' hand, saying, I'm not going to let this happen. And he turns to Peter. We know from other accounts, from other Gospels, that he heals Malchus and puts his ear back on, de-escalates. It's okay, guys. He turns to Peter and says, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given to me? Peter, this is not out of my control. This is not a surprise. I know what's happening. This is from the Father. Peter, get on the same page. So then move down. Let's go down to 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, all through the Gospel of John, one disciple is not mentioned by name. Do you know who that disciple is? Never mentions John, although John is the author. And so we assume that he often says this, the disciple whom Jesus loved, or another disciple. He uses this nondescript, and the assumption is when he uses this nondescript of the disciple that he's speaking about John himself. So it says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside of the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl, who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You're also not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not. I am not a disciple of Jesus." Now, why is he saying that? Has he lost his faith? Has he turned away from Jesus and doesn't want to follow him, doesn't love him anymore, doesn't care about him? Is that why he's saying, "I'm not a disciple"? Let's be fair to Peter. That doesn't at all seem to be where his heart is. In fact, it's almost the opposite. Remember, Jesus has said to him, Jesus said, "You will all abandon me. You will all leave me." And what did Peter say? "Even if all these other suckers leave you, I will never leave you." So it very well could be that Peter is saying, I promised Jesus that I would stay with him. And in order to get in this door, what do I have to do to get by this servant girl? I have to lie. I have to deny Christ. I have to say I'm not his disciple so that I can stay with him, is what I assume is happening here. Peter is saying, I want to stand with Christ. I want to be with Christ. I told him I would be with him. The servant girl asked, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" If that's what I have to do to get in the door, then so be it. No, I'm not one of his disciples. And he gets in the door. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. John's going to bring all of this back again in chapter 21. The 3 denials, the charcoal fire, just file that away for chapter 21. Now we jump from Peter's interaction with the servant girl to Jesus' interaction with the high priest. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching, and Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." It's as if they're having this trial, like, we want to figure out what you've been teaching. And Jesus' argument is, what I've been teaching in front of everyone. You've stood there and heard me teach. You've been listening and trying to trip me up all this time I've been in Jerusalem. You've been asking me questions and trying to get me to incriminate myself. Everyone has been around. I've spoken openly. If you really want to know what I'm teaching, if that's what this is about, you've brought me here to figure out what I'm teaching, you can ask anybody what I've been teaching. You yourselves know what I've been teaching. This is not about what I've been teaching. So, as often happens when an intellectual argument is destroyed, the authorities resort to force. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Clearly trying to use force to intimidate Jesus. So you've got Peter, who has to face a servant girl and is intimidated by the situation, decides to lie in order to try to get past the servant girl so he can get in and not get into any trouble. Jesus is now facing the high priests, answers them intellectually, saying, if this is about what I've been teaching, you can ask anybody. That's not a secret. Why am I here? One of the guards hits him, says, "How dare you answer the high priest like that?" Now look what Jesus comes back to. Doesn't resort to force, doesn't resort to anger or a temper. Calmly comes back and says, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? How does hitting me help your argument? What point does hitting me make? It doesn't change what I've said. Either what I said was wrong, then correct me. But if what I said wasn't wrong, what does hitting me have to do with it? How does that help you? So again, John is showing us these interactions, Jesus and Peter. Now Peter and Jesus. Peter denies Christ in order to get in the gate. Jesus is hit, and they try to intimidate Jesus, and he won't and can't be intimidated. One last interaction there, 25 to 27 and then 33 to 38. Now Simon Peter was standing outside and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Why is that important? That's what Jesus had said. Remember, we back up to that time Jesus in the upper room says, all of you are going to abandon me. Peter says, even if all of the rest of these people abandon you, I will never abandon you. Even if I have to die for you, I will not abandon you. And then says, really? You'll die for me, Peter? Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And here we have that playing out. We have Peter. In other Gospels, again, we're told Peter understands what happens. He hears the rooster. One Gospel says that Jesus turns and looks at him. They make eye contact, and Peter is overcome with guilt over what he's done. So Peter, again, twice denies that he's a disciple, twice denies that he knows Christ. But it's interesting, now we have Jesus' interaction, and it's not with the authorities anymore, it's with Pilate this time. So go over to 1833. Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord?" No problem, Yola. If it was anyone else, but I can't be upset with Yola. Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate replies, "What is truth?" Isn't this interesting? Peter is faced with direct questions that he knows, if I say yes, I'm going to get into trouble. If I say no, I'm denying Jesus Christ. So he's faced with these direct questions, yes or no. I'm going to say no because that seems like that'll be the easier way to get through this situation. Even though it's a lie, even though I am a disciple, even though this means I'm denying Christ, if I say no, it makes things simpler. Jesus is faced with direct questions. Are you the king of the Jews? Which is also tricky, because if he says yes, they can now try him as an insurrectionist, try him as someone who's trying to claim authority, try him as someone who's trying to fight against Rome. If he says no, he's denying the rightful authority that he has over the Jews. So Peter's faced with a direct question. Jesus is faced with a direct question. Peter decides to lie to make things easier. Do you notice what Jesus does when he's faced with a direct question? Are you the king of the Jews? He doesn't say yes or no. He says, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Again, this is not Jesus like quivering, with his lower lip shaking because he's facing the representative of the entire Roman government in front of him. This is Jesus looking a man in the eyes and saying, "Why are you asking me that question? Where does that question come from? What are you saying about me?" Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew. I don't care or know who the king is. What have you done? Why have you been turned over?" And Jesus answers, "My kingdom is not of this world." He doesn't deny that he's a king, because that would be wrong. He doesn't claim that he's a political king, because that would be wrong. He says, "My kingdom, I do have a kingdom, and I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world." But then he turns it and he says, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Isn't that interesting in contrast? Because what has Peter just done? Peter has just lied to get in the courtyard. And Peter has just lied to save trouble. And then Peter has just lied again so that he wouldn't be caught, wouldn't be arrested, whatever he feared would happen if he told the truth. And as Peter is contrasted lying, Jesus is contrasted bearing witness to the truth and facing the same kind of difficult, direct questions, and yet facing it so much better and answering those questions so much better than Peter is answering his questions. Now, at this point, it's basically the chapter 18 that we've read through. The conclusion is kind of like, well, so if your point is that Jesus is smarter than Peter, we all knew that before we came to church this morning. If your point is that Jesus has more intellectual answers or a better way of answering questioning than Peter or than you or I, that's not a surprise either. Of course Jesus did well, and of course Jesus did what was right and found the right answers and said the right things and wasn't intimidated because he knew what was going on. He was in control. He was told by the Father he was prepared to drink this cup that was given to him. But the thing that you'd miss in all of that is John doesn't tell us a really important part to understand Peter's part of this story. My mom, I don't know if I should tell this story. We like to tease my mom because when I was a teenager, she came out and she blurted the words out, "I love to go to bed with Frank Harvey? What's Harvey? Paul Harvey." She said, "I love to go to bed with Paul Harvey." And that's all we needed. As teenagers, we took that and ran with it. Well, what she meant was that Paul Harvey came on at 10 o'clock at night, and he gives you, do you guys even remember Paul? Half of the room remembers Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was this radio. There used to be radio, and you'd put little antenna up, and you'd catch waves, and you'd listen to the radio. And Paul Harvey would give you news, and then right at the end of the news, he would give you a story, and then what would his tagline be? And now, the rest of the story. And you always waited till the end of his news section to hear this story and then the rest of the story. And that's kind of the way it is. John has written this story for us, and you see Jesus doing so well, and you see Peter doing so poorly. But there's the story behind the story. Turn over to Matthew 26. I should clear my mom's name. She was just talking about the radio. She liked to turn the radio on as she went to bed. So Matthew 26, verse 36. John 18, the story we just read, starts with, after Jesus said these things, he was in the garden, and Judas brings a group of soldiers to him. Matthew tells us about what happens in the garden right before Judas comes with the soldiers. You all know this story as well. Verse 36, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Peter, obviously, is the Peter we're talking about. The two sons of Zebedee are James and John. So John is one of the people that was in John 18. James isn't mentioned. Peter, James, and John, Jesus takes a little bit further away from the other 9 disciples, and he tells Peter, James, and John, "Stay here. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Verse 40, he came to the disciples. You got the group of 9 disciples. Peter, James, John, and Jesus have walked a little ways off. Now the 3 of them are left here, and Jesus is by himself praying. He comes back to the 3 of them, and he finds them sleeping. He came to the disciples and found them sleeping. He said to who? He said to Peter, "Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." I always thought that Jesus wanted his friends to be watching and praying with him for his sake, that he knew what he was about to go through, that he knew the difficulty that he was going to go through. And he says, "I need my friends beside me. Come watch and pray for me, for what I'm about to go through." But then you look at John 18 and you see Jesus excelling and Peter failing. Jesus excelling and Peter failing. Jesus excelling and Peter failing. And then you go back to this story, and Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and says, pray. And then he goes and he prays, and he comes back and he says, have you fallen asleep? Do you not understand? This is the time to pray. This is the time to prepare. So, in your notes, Jesus tried to get Peter to prepare for the battle, but Peter slept. See, Peter, who's so eager to grab the sword and to pull it and to fight, Peter's got the fighter mentality. He's got this assertive, aggressive personality. But when it's time to fight is not when the soldiers come. Are you getting this? This is the time to fight. This is when Jesus is telling Peter, now is the time for battle. Now is the time to prepare. Now is the time to wake up. And you're sleeping. Watch and pray that you do not enter into temptation. Because there is a fight coming. And if you don't fight now, you're going to fail then. So he leaves them again, and he goes and prays. Verse 42, again for the second time he went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Do you hear him preparing himself for the battle? When the soldiers come, Peter draws the sword, cuts off the ear. Jesus puts the ear back on, looks at Peter and says, should I not drink the cup that the Father has given to me? Where has he come to that conclusion? Where has he settled that in his mind? Right here, in prayer, alone with his Father. He has already settled what he's going to do. He has already prepared for what's coming. And when it comes, he deals with it victoriously, and he succeeds because he is prepared. And when it comes for Peter, who has slept at this time, what does Peter do at this time? Peter fails. Peter acts foolishly because he has not prepared. He has not prayed. He has not been ready for what's coming. Jesus tried to get Peter to prepare for the battle, but Peter slept. And then, if you'll write this, his spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak. We use that phrase all the time. Your spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. Verse 43, again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later on. You hear that? There's a time for sleep. This has not been the time for sleep. Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Verse 47, while he was still speaking those words, Judas came out, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests. So when we pick up the story in John 18 of Judas coming, Matthew, as well as Luke, tells us that as the words are coming out of his mouth, Judas walks up. This incident is just wrapping up as Judas comes with soldiers. Peter's spirit was willing, but his flesh was weak. When I read that, what I think is, I want to do the right thing. And so many of us want to do what's right. If there were just two buttons on the wall, like do right or do wrong, I really believe a lot of us would hit the do right button. If it were that simple, of just, which do I want to do? I really want to do what's right. But good intentions are not good enough. Just being sincere is not good enough. Peter is absolutely 100% sincere when he pulls the sword. Peter is absolutely 100% thinking he's doing what's right, thinking he's helping Jesus. And yet, in all three ways, showing that Jesus is under control, protecting the disciples, drinking the cup, in all three ways, Peter's actions are directly contradicting what Jesus Christ is trying to do. He's sincere, his spirit is willing, he wants to, and he's trying to do what's right, but what has he not done? He is not prepared. He has not done the work when it needed to be done. And now when he's trying to do it, he's doing it wrong. He fails here. He fails with the servant girl at the gate. He fails with the second person asking him. He fails with the third person asking him. I have no questions about Peter's intents, about Peter's heart, about Peter's desires. But all 4 times he fails because he's not prepared for what's coming. Because in the garden, when Jesus says, this is the time to pray, this is the time to prepare, the weariness, the tiredness, the desires of the flesh overcame the willingness of the Spirit. What about us? How many of you would say there are things I want to do spiritually? I have good intentions. I want to read my Bible every day. I want to be a godly husband and a godly wife, a great parent to my children. I want to glorify God. I wrote some of these down. We want to glorify God. But so many times, I don't think about that until it's the end of the day, and then I look back and say, how did I do today? And if it's the end of the day and you look back, guess what you're probably going to find behind you? That the day came and went, opportunities came and went, and you weren't prepared to take them. I want to share my faith. I want to defend my faith. But if I wait until someone questions me or challenges me or attacks my faith, I'm not going to have the words, the replies, the answers that I need. We did a course on apologetics, and they said apologetics is kind of like learn a muscle. You either use it and strengthen it, or you don't use it and weaken it. And when it comes time to use it, you put a pull-up bar back there, and I grab on. I could want to pull up all I want. But wanting to doesn't make it happen, right? Intending to, really sincerely wanting to make it happen. If you haven't prepared, it doesn't happen. We want to be sexually pure. But if you wait until you're alone with someone of the opposite sex, you guys can fill in the rest of the story. If you wait until the moment and then you say, then I'm going to decide, and then I'm going to put up the barriers, and then I'm going to make the right decision. If you go all the way and then you say, right at the last minute, I'm going to do the right thing. How many people, how many men and women have thought, I'll do the right thing when it really matters? When it gets to this, I won't go too far. I'll go up to there, but I won't go too far. Lots of children are born that way. Lots of marriages are destroyed that way. Lots of innocence is stolen that way. You prepare ahead of time. If you wait until the moment is there, you will not be prepared and you will fail. We want to suffer well. I've seen people be diagnosed with incurable diseases and die in ways that are incredibly glorifying to God. You watch them suffer and you watch them die and you say, wow, how did they do that? Because they prepared before they were sick. They thought through these things before they got sick. You don't wait until the doctor gives you a diagnosis to start saying, what do I really believe about God's goodness? What do I really believe about God's sovereignty? What do I really believe about life and death? If you haven't thought through those questions before the diagnosis, the cloud of the diagnosis and the cloud of suffering is not going to help you think those things through in the diagnosis. We want to suffer well, but we also want to succeed well. Have you guys seen, is it Robert Carr? The quarterback? It's not Robert. The quarterback for the Raiders? Derek. Just got the biggest contract, I think, in the NFL. And in his news conference, He's just made millions and millions and millions guaranteed contract. And at his news conference, talking about the contract, he says, well, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to tithe from this money. Now, you tithe from $10 and that's $1. And you think, well, that's not a big deal. I can give $1. You tithe from 10 million or you tithe from $100 million and you're talking $10 million. You don't decide that when you get the contract. That has to be something you've thought through and decided beforehand. We want to be generous with our time and money, but if you don't think about it and you don't plan to be beforehand, the opportunities are going to come and go and you're not going to take them. We want to have great family conversations. I want to be the kind of dad that looks back and remembers deep, meaningful talks with my children. But I really love my cell phone. And there are so many times that I'm staring at my smartphone while my kids are staring at their smartphones, and we're sitting beside each other, and there aren't a lot of conversations happening between the two of us. The spirit is willing. If you ask me, do you want to have conversations with your children? Yeah, absolutely I want to have conversations with my children. And they want to have conversations with me. But the flesh is weak, and I'm not prepared to make the opportunities happen. On Facebook, one of my friends, he's a coach, coaches basketball, and he had this hashtag, and I hate hashtags, but I stole it from him. He was dealing with one of his students who's now out of high school and is pursuing and making something of their life. And at the end of his Facebook post, he said, "Success is not an accident." And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Jesus' success in John 18 was not just good luck. It was not just Jesus because he's God and he said all the right things because God whispered in his ear all the right things to say. Jesus prepared for what was going to happen to him. Jesus did. Jesus did. He prayed and he prepared and he got his heart right and he got his mind right so that when those things happened, he would be successful. If Jesus has to prepare for the battle, don't you and I have to prepare for the battle? Success is not an accident. This is mine, this wasn't his, so this is original. Those who succeed prepare, and those who prepare will succeed. Now, kids, this is what's called a proverb. In other words, it's not true each and every time. Just this week, one of my kids studied and studied and studied for a test and didn't do as well in the test as they wanted to do. And as I'm consoling them, they say, you know what, I saw other kids. They didn't study for the test, and they did better than I did on the test. And it feels like I prepared and I worked and I still didn't succeed. But those who prepare will succeed. You may have test grades that you don't like, and you may have incidents where you have an opportunity to do and to act and you don't do it the way you want to. But overall, when you prepare, you will find yourself succeeding. Big picture in our lives. So before we close, I want to ask you to just pull this into your life. Probably every single one of us have good intentions, things we want to be doing. Things, if you asked us this button or this button, we would choose the good button. We would say, yeah, I want to do that. But we haven't prepared, and so it's not happening in our lives. We're failing just like Peter failed because we're not spending the time ahead of time to pray. We're not spending the ahead of time to plan, to think, to work, to practice, so that when the opportunity comes, we can take it. Would you spend some time today? You don't have to. In my life, there are about 17 things that I want to be doing better than I'm doing, that I need to be preparing better. But would you focus on one thing? Spiritually, this is something I want to do better. This is something I want to improve on. And then would you think about backing up from that? How do I need to prepare in order to make this happen? When am I failing? What's happening when I'm failing at doing this? How can I prepare to set myself up to succeed at doing this? We hear lots of sermons. And you walk out and you say, yeah, that was great. Thank you. But I'm asking you to do something about this, to follow this up today. Spend some time identifying one thing that spiritually you want to do and you're not doing. And then spend some time thinking and planning and preparing of saying, what do I need to do in my life to make this happen? What do I need to do beforehand to make this a reality?